Hey there, Robonzo here. This is a dual interview featuring Simon Tam and myself. We talk about what he's doing for the music community through podcasting, public speaking, and writing. Also, we talk about his band, his activism, and how it has all come together for his career and his efforts to help other independent musicians. And then Simon interviews me for his podcast, Music Business Hacks. Let's do this. This is the Unstarving Musicians Podcast. I'm your host, Robonzo. This podcast features conversations with me and indie music artists. Conversations intended to help other indie musicians be better at marketing, business, the creative process, and all the other things that empower us to do more of what we love. Make music. Simon's band, The Slants, is an all-Asian pop band that does well over 150 shows a year. There's a great story behind the band and a trademark dispute that we discuss too. His drive and accomplishments, though, they are what's really interesting. I want to say thanks to everyone who supports this podcast. The whole thing is intended to help independent musicians. Help them through a curation of expertise of other musicians and industry professionals. If you're loving the podcast, if you support the cause, visit unstarvingmusician.com/crowd sponsor to learn about the various ways that you can offer your support. And by the way, if you're a listener of the podcast, I consider you a supporter, especially if you share it with a friend. Again, that's unstarvingmusician.com/crowd sponsor to learn how you can get involved as a supporter. Have you heard of Bandzoogle? They power websites for musicians around the world, including Grammy winners. Their easy-to-use system will get you online fast. They have tons of mobile-friendly templates to help you customize your design and site content. It's built for musicians by musicians. Bandzoogle makes it easy to sell merch, grow your email list, integrate your socials, and they offer support from a musician-friendly team 7 days a week. Plans are affordable. Go to bandzoogle.com to start your 30-day free trial. Use the promo code Robonzo to get 15% off your first year. Again, that's bandzoogle.com, promo code Robonzo, R-O-B-O-N-Z-O. So yeah, Simon Tam is super entrepreneurial and always has been. He explains the process of creating 300 plus episodes for his podcast, Music Business Hacks, how it emerged from a blog and ultimately produced a book. His multifaceted career and mindset is inspirational. He's a fun guy to talk to, too. Here's me and Simon Tam. I suppose where I was hoping to start is my amazement at the daily episodes, of the Music Business Hacks podcast. I somewhat recently discovered it or revisited it, and I believe when I contacted you recently, I mentioned I was checking out the episode on imposter syndrome, but I was listening to some more just today and perusing all these topics, and I was like, wow, that's a lot of stuff and a lot of planning. So tell me a little bit about how you make that happen and how it feeds into the other things that you do.
Sure. So the idea for the podcast really was kind of more of a spur-of-the-moment thing than anything else. Last February, I just kind of woke up and I was like, I should do a podcast show. And if I'm going to do it, I might as well try this idea of making it daily. And I wanted to do it that way because I published a book a couple years ago called Music Business Hacks, with the idea that if you were to just allocate a certain amount of time every day, even if it's as little as 15 minutes a day, that if you're persistent and strategic about it, over time, you'll really see a lot of great proven results. And so I thought, what if I took the same concept and turned it into a podcast where, if someone is listening, if there's a musician out there who's like, I don't know what to do about my business. I don't know what to work on. There's too much stuff to work on. Well, what I do with each episode is I break it down and say, okay, here's a very, very specific topic. Here's a couple of steps, and here's the activity that you should work on today. If you can dedicate 10 or 30 minutes of your time to developing your music career, here's a very specific area that you can do that will help you in some kind of way advance your career goal. So that's kind of how the concept began. And really, I just started hitting that record button and just kind of going every day. Most episodes I keep fairly short. They're I think the average episode's 7 to 8 minutes long, because I want to give people time to work on that particular task. But about once a week or so, I'll do kind of an extended interview, and I'll do some kind of recap. just to give a little bit of variety. But as far as like how the topics come up, some of them come from the book, some come from just watching the news. But what I would do is I would just think of an idea and just kind of reflect on it, like throughout the day or the morning, and then I would just hop on, record, edit, and publish.
Well, what a stream of consciousness you have, because I was wondering, I'm thinking, man, that is pretty impressive to daily, even if many of them are 7 minutes, as you say, to address so many of those topics. I really love it, and I'm impressed. Like for me, it sounds like your podcast was born of a book that you wrote, which is how I like to talk about mine. But was there something? What was it that inspired you to help other musicians by? I'm assuming you kind of started with the book, Music Business Hacks. What inspired you to help other musicians?
Well, I guess it's something that I've been passionate about for a while. So I started my first company when I was 13, and it was I started a record label, and then I started a music promotion company and kind of booking service when I was in high school. And so I got started at a really early age because I think I had a natural inclination to look at the business side of things, which is not really natural for musicians. Most musicians are worried about the songs and working on the craft, which they absolutely should be. But I think, I grew up around entrepreneurs, and so I was always like thinking about, well, how do you market the song? How do you find the right audience for it? Or how do you find the best place for it? And it was just something, being surrounded by musicians, I'm always like, oh, well, here's an idea. Maybe you can try doing this. And so I think that kind of mindset started at a really early age. I kind of fused music with music business pretty early on in my career. And as a result, it was kind of natural. So over the years, I would, especially as I started booking for bands in high school, and there'd be bands on, Kill Rock Stars or Lookout Records, all those kind of mid-90s punk labels, that kind of got me into booking for members of the Ramones, TSOL, the Misfits, and so on. So really kind of like cut my teeth on punk rock, since that's what I loved. But they kind of would refer me to other musicians, and the word would kind of get around. So I would just kind of naturally consult. Eventually what happened is in 2008, right around the height of the economy collapsing, I was laid off of my job, and I just had a lot of time. So I was like, I started a blog, and I just started writing a blog about how musicians could get funding through sponsorships, and then how they could optimize their touring. And that blog kind of started taking off. So I just basically took all those entries and published a book. And then I made more blogs. And then I started writing for, Billboard, a music think tank, and so on. And it just kind of like expanded and expanded. Now I have this daily podcast show. Like it wasn't like I was thinking like of, hey, I'm going to create this empire of like helping out musicians. It just was like, I'll write this article. Sure. I'll answer your question. Okay. And whenever I did that, it would lead to more questions. More musicians would contact me like, oh, what about this? What about that? And it just became like this very, very organic process.
Wow. I love that. And something to be said for starting early. And I really like about you that you're not only on a mission to help other musicians, but you are actively a musician these days. And the project that I noticed, that I don't know that it's the only one, is your band The Slants, which happens to have some new music out, newish at least. And that you have an interesting story around the name of the band and the trademark. Give my listeners just a little bit of history about the band and maybe a mention about that whole trademark thing.
Sure. So I started the band in 2006, and the idea was to start a band that would provide this kind of bold portrayal of Asian American culture, because something that I found really lacking, especially in mainstream entertainment. And I mean, it seems kind of weird now, but when I started the band, there wasn't a single Hollywood film that had an Asian American starring in a lead role.
Wow, that's crazy.
We had zero presence in terms of television shows. So I was looking for some kind of representation, and rock and roll felt even worse. I mean, back then, not a single Asian American had ever been featured on Rolling Stone, Pitchfork, Spin. So it was just like I was craving those kind of social mirrors, and that's why I started this band. And I called it The Slants because, I wanted to provide this perspective or our slant on life of what it was like to be Asian American while navigating the music industry. What ended up happening was a couple years after I started it, we applied to register for our trademark, but the government took a lot of issue with it. They said it's inappropriate, it's disparaging or racist to have your band calling themselves The Slants. They said we were racist towards Asian people, even though my entire band was, Asian people. So they decided to kind of support their evidence using UrbanDictionary.com and other kind of wiki joke websites. Well, we appealed using academics, surveys, dictionary experts, and executive directors of organizations. They doubled down and they said, no, AsianJokes.com says it's offensive, so we're going to go with that. Eventually, we changed our argument and said, you know what, this law you're using, it's in violation of our First Amendment rights. So, long story short, after about 8 years, that battle took us before the United States Supreme Court, where we won unanimously in this landmark case. We overturned this 70-year-old law that was being used to punish primarily artists, nonprofits, and small business owners, and basically help secure freedom of expression in our country. So it was like one of those really unexpected things when I started the band. It kind of took over my life for many years. And nowadays, I'm still a part of the band. But what's funny is like it kind of shifted our model. So now we actually spend a lot of our time touring and performing at law conventions and lawyer type events and law schools and that sort of thing. And it's great. It pays the bills. Lawyers love us. And it's always funny because I'll go to like a law convention and they're like, oh, you guys are like the biggest like band in the world. I'm like, only to like trademark attorneys, like not to anybody else.
What a niche though. That's great.
Yeah, but it worked. It's worked out well, and it's helped us move our activism work forward. So we've actually been able to start a nonprofit organization, and now we actually give scholarships and mentoring to other artists of color who want to incorporate activism into their work.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, I had read about your activism. I think that it was a nice introduction for me, inadvertent introduction to your activism, and I don't know if that's where it necessarily starts, but let me shift gears. Obviously, your work with musicians, as I mentioned earlier, was of high interest to me. I was curious to know, because of the model of your podcast, the daily thing, the book, and some of the other things you've done, is there a current, I don't know what the answer is going to be, but is there a current musician struggle of the month? Do things kind of pop up on your radar that is a sort of at times feels like a really broad, even universal struggle that musicians are really identifying with at the time?
I'm not sure if there's like a totally universal thing that of the month, but I would say there is this universal idea in that musicians are, especially in the last decade or so, have been struggling to find a good balance between being an artist and running a business, because it's like very hard these days to be an independent musician without knowing how to also be an entrepreneur, knowing how to like run that business side of things. Right. And what I find is that a lot of people are kind of learning about the business side of things just by reading books, listening to podcasts, or like listening to other people's strategies and then trying to copy that. But they're not approaching the business side of things with the same level of creativity, passion, and expression as they are with their music. And I'm always encouraging that musicians that really you need to like tackle the business side of things with the same level of creativity, the willingness to experiment, the willingness to like really know yourself, like, you know, your uniqueness, what makes you as a musician, and what makes your music like distinct. That's what's special. It's not how well you copy other people. So when it comes to the business side of things, like there are certainly best practices that we should like have a good grasp on, but we should also learn how to like tweak those things and make them our own, like truly own them so that it feels natural, that it feels like authentic. And I think that is the thing that I see most musicians really struggling with the most.
Yeah, I like that a lot. The other thing I was curious about, it looks like you do a lot of public speaking. I'm guessing it's on a somewhat broad range. How much of that touches on music or the music business?
I would say a good percentage. It depends on the kind of event. So I'll go to a certain events. Like next week, I'm going to be speaking at the DIY Musician Conference in Austin, and talking about, you know, how to build niche audiences, social media, and that sort of thing. But sometimes I'll get brought into organizations like Toyota, Walmart, Google, Facebook, and teach them about marketing, especially in like cultural competent ways, like how to market towards diverse audiences. And then the other kind of hat that I wear, so to speak, is going to those law events and telling them my story about going to the Supreme Court. But I would say that no matter what kind of venue or what kind of topic that I'm like centrally focused on, I almost always bring it back to music in some kind of way. So like when I talk about law, I'm not just telling the story of my band. I also talk about a very specific theory. Like if attorneys and law students want to create change, I tell them like my best advice for winning a case at the Supreme Court is to actually stop thinking like an attorney. You should think like an artist does, and, you know, begin with the vision of what you'd like and then work out the steps to get there. So I try and make it very arts oriented whenever possible, because that's my world, like first and foremost. And no matter what topic I'm speaking on, I find that music and art is a great way to bring people together, even if they have disagreements over my perspective, or, you know, if they don't know the same experience I have, that it could be a great way for them to enter in, connect, and engage.
How often does your band gig?
I'm sorry?
I'm switching gears on you, by the way. How often does your band gig?
We do about 150 to 180 shows a year.
Wow.
So we stay pretty busy, but I would, there's a caveat. This November is our final show.
Oh, wow. So
I'm retiring the band after 13 years this fall, because, our singer just had a baby, and he's now going to be a father, and it's just been like tougher and tougher to move forward with that kind of traditional model. But we're also going to change our approach, and there's this idea that we have of like, this is what a band does. You put out albums, you tour in support of those albums, and you kind of repeat this cycle again and again and again. Well, our band is still going to be together in a sense that we're going to use our platform to try and help other artists. So our next album is going to be featuring talent from across North America, where we'll have a full album. We'll write it, we'll compose it, but the talent that's going to be featured on it will be other up and coming artists, so that hopefully we can kind of pass the torch on to that next generation. Plus, we're still busy with other stuff. Like we got the nonprofit. I'm composing music right now because there's a Broadway musical that's being written about my band and our story. There's like a film and a documentary that's being produced. So there's all these other pieces that are like related. We're just not going to like tour quite as much anymore, because it's just really hard to manage all these projects, have a family, and still like be on the road.
You know, I was thinking ahead, thinking I got to know I have to know how you'll transition your music creativity, that aspect of who you are. But clearly, you have lots of projects still, just from the band alone.
Yeah, it keeps me busy.
You are listening to my conversation with Simon Tam of the Music Business Hacks podcast and The Slants. And this is a clip from the track 1821 by The Slants.
Remember counting the days, remember grasping for moments. Freedom was a digit away. Remember thinking the world close upon you like an island. Peering through, seeing proof. Remember when you were teenage, staring up at the ceiling. Emotions like a runaway train. Remember making the promise to yourself not to be cautious, flawless and wandering. The watchful eyes, they all misjudge. One breath, you're on the cusp. You were 18, now you're 21. Drew their lines and they changed their mind. You were 18.
And you're also busy as well with the Unstarving Musician. So, I'm wondering if you could kind of share a bit about your process, like for listeners on the music business hack side of things. Like you began with a book. Can you talk about like what inspired you to like change from the book to creating that podcast? Was it to have an additional reach and platform for the book itself, or did you start noticing things and you realized that there was space for this and wanted to, host those conversations with musicians and professionals over the last couple hundred episodes you've done the show?
The short answer is yes. But there was some encouragement. I mean, when I wrote the book, which was really about my experience as a gigging musician, and I've always been a musician who's had, a day job, if you will. I've been in the marketing and technology world for many years. But I really enjoyed playing. I always tell people that performing live is my zen. And I'm a drummer for anybody who's maybe hearing this for the first time, but a drummer and a singer. And I just noticed some people around me struggled to do what was coming pretty easy for me. And I always just say it was, playing at will anywhere with whom I wanted and getting paid. And some of my close peers and friends struggled with this. And so then I started thinking, like, I bet other people struggle with it. And there was a realization for I guess, one of those light bulb moments for an idea for the group. And it was the first time that I looked at my calendar in late December, and I had gigs booked the entire next year. And I knew, certainly some of my peers were doing that, before me, but a lot of people weren't. I mean, they were kind of just struggling to get the next gig. So leading on to the next thing, I don't even recall if it was during the writing of the book or after, probably during. I thought, this would be really cool if I could somehow create a community that educates independent musicians. And initially I was thinking a little broader than what it has turned into. I thought I'd kind of hit musicians of all types and genres. In reality, it has turned out I've hit, I have conversations with a lot of songwriters and some people that are a little more like me. Most of these people are working in some sort of original music capacity. But I've spoken to, bands that are corporate gig monsters, I like to call them. They're doing all the festivals and all the,
Sure.
corporate gigs and just, loving that. And then the encouragement part came, being in the marketing world and kind of discovering podcasting. One guy led me to another, and I meet a guy who's British. His name is Chris Ducker, and joined his little mastermind group a while back, and one day he said to me, that's not a very good British accent, he says, you've got to start a podcast. I think he was telling a lot of people that at the time, but I'm comfortable on a microphone. The one thing I discovered that was a little bit of a surprise is how much I enjoy asking questions and trying to ask thoughtful questions and trying to ask questions based on those responses, so the art of the interview. And so it's been an evolving thing. The audience has niched down a little bit, which is probably a good thing. I know everyone says that's a good thing. I'm beginning to sort of try not let myself get stuck with that idea. But I also like to chat with industry people, and you're kind of an in-between for me. You're an active music artist, and you're doing a lot of things to help musicians. So that's where the podcast has been going. And then in my playing world, it's funny. Not long after all that started, my wife and I moved from Silicon Valley, which was my music market for well over 10 years, and prior to that, Dallas-Fort Worth. But we moved from there out of the country to Panama, and not only to Panama, but we're currently living in basically the beach life in a nice little community, but there's not the population density and consequently not the musician density that I was accustomed to. So I've had the good fortune, though, of playing with a couple of the most popular artists in Panama, and some of those are expats like myself. And that's been great. But and today, and thanks to the podcast, actually, and talking to so many artists, I'm walking into a new chapter where, because performing is just not as available as it once was. So I'm walking into a new chapter where I'm going to build out a very small video and recording studio and do more of what I do online.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think it's so important to be flexible, to kind of respond to those needs. It was one of the same reasons why I saw an opportunity. Like, I started getting invited to speak at law schools here and there, and I thought, okay, well, why not? Why not lean into this and see where it goes? So it's interesting that you kind of you mentioned that you started getting into this podcast, and from it you discovered that you really like interviewing people, and that was something that I found with my show as well. Like, when I first began, I wrote out all these questions that I was like, okay, I'm going to ask everybody all these questions. And then after doing it a few times, felt so like static, felt kind of boring that I realized, wait, I can customize this a bit more and allow it, give it some room to breathe, and realize that not only did it help me become a better interviewer, but it also helped me become a better interviewee. Like, as I was on the other side of the microphone, or the camera, if you will, it just was like, it just kind of taught me like what kinds of things are better ways to get certain ideas across. And so I'm wondering, how often are you being interviewed these days, as opposed to like being the one asking the questions all the time?
Well, it's funny. It's much far less than I've been the interviewer, and that's been by my own doing. And I was listening. I mentioned your episode on imposter syndrome, and that's one of the big things, that has slowed me down. But when I reached out to you and some others, and I have to tell anyone who's thinking about whether it's reaching out to a venue or some sort of rep or a podcast to be a guest on it, it's been a kind of a second effort. I did it a while back, but not as successfully, I guess, in short. But this time, for whatever reason, I felt a little more comfortable with it, and I tried to be very forthcoming about my motives. And of course, I genuinely do appreciate your work and the work that I'm. If I run across something that I'm like, well, maybe they need a little more time to make this better or something, or it just doesn't seem to click with me, that's obviously not going to be someone I would even talk to. But I've tried to be very forthcoming about what I'm doing, trying to grow my own audience. So really, to answer the question, it's been a lot less. But occasionally I get the treat of a guest turning a question back on me. And that's not always from a podcaster, although most frequently. And today, by the way, what a brilliant idea that you had for us. Those of you listening, we'd actually scheduled a couple of different times to be on one another's shows. I really liked Simon's show and Music Business Hacks, and I thought he'd be perfect to speak on the Unstarving Musician. And we had a little mix-up, and Simon was quick enough on his feet to say, "You want to try and do combo? I've done this before." And yeah, it was great. So this is a fun. I suppose it's one of those times where I get to share the Q&A.
Yeah, it's like a 2-for-1. But one of the things that I will say is, like, I do appreciate you reaching out, and you're very, very clear about it, and I appreciated it. It was one of those things that I think is perhaps comes with a bit of experience from like booking gigs and knowing that you have something of value to offer people, and also not being shy about that. And I know that's a big part of your book, The Unstarving Musician's Guide to Getting Paid Gigs as well, is like this idea that you ought to get paid what you're worth. And so I'm wondering, like, when you started writing the book, and obviously backed by a lot of like personal experience, like kind of supporting these ideas, what was that process like when you started getting this information out into the hands of artists and they started like reading it and actually applying these principles, like is that also part of the reason that you decided, hey, I'm going to expand on this, I'm going to get into these like kind of these group discussions, but also have this podcast, because you could see in the real world how it was actually affecting like people's lives?
I think it was a little bit more for me, about just trying to make it something a little bigger and a little farther reaching, and getting gigs in the capacity and getting paid in the capacity that I was in 10 plus years. It's all great, but there's so much more, especially today, as you mentioned earlier. There's so much more to being in the music business, whether you're a full-time person, have been for a long time, just quit your day job, or you've decided, you know what, I've done that. I'm going to work this job and I'm going to play music a little bit more in an easier fashion. My talent is honed, and I'm going to play it more on my terms because I don't have to do it. So I thought this would be great and it was kind of scary because I thought, well, I don't even know all these different worlds. I know gigging. I've done a little bit of writing, collaborative writing and arranging, a tiny bit of recording, and most of those years were, pre-Instagram. So I didn't know a lot about the many things that are happening, but and it's just been fortuitous that I'm learning so much from the people that I talk to, and so now I'm trying to share that. I always say that the Unstarving Musician is about curating expertise, a little bit from me and a lot from the others that I speak to, for the benefit of listeners and subscribers and community members.
Yeah, I think that's great. In fact, I found something very similar with my own show, that I'm always fascinated by the wisdom and perspective of people who are tackling the music industry from very different genres, or who have like very different approaches to the same ideas. And it's kind of interesting. It's like, man, if you really want to like learn, like, don't be afraid to ask questions. Start your own show, like start your own blog or resource, because like you get connected to the folks in all kinds of interesting ways, and have the privilege of being able to learn from their own experiences and their own wisdom. Like that's something I've definitely really enjoyed about having my show. So, are you? What's next on the horizon for you? Are you going to be in Panama for quite some time, or like, are you there for good, or?
For now, yes, but my wife and I'm here with my wife, and we have always said, we don't know how we're going to feel next year or what life might bring us. And, lately we've actually been we've been entertaining the idea of buying a property in my hometown of Fort Worth, Texas. We have a lot of friends, and we both have family in that area. So it could be that someday we end up back there, but we have the wanderlust too. So when we travel occasionally, we've learned to, not fall in love with every place and think that we should move there over the years. But, occasionally we run into a place like, wow, this is kind of magical. We should come back here. Maybe, maybe someday. But, the immediate future is we'll stay here. It's a life that is more tranquilo, as I explained to the Panamanians who learn a little bit more about me and where I'm from and why, who ask why we're here. But the next part really is for me creatively is to work on that studio that I mentioned earlier, and continue to find ways to help other musicians, and of course make the whole Unstarving Musician thing sustainable, so that I can keep serving others and take care of myself. Sure.
And it's funny because like I also recently moved about 2 years ago. I moved from Portland, Oregon to Nashville, Tennessee, and it was also like I just wanted to try and do something a bit different. And what's funny is like even though they call it Music City, I don't do a lot. Like I don't perform a lot here in Nashville. In fact, 99% of my appearances are outside of the city, because the industry here is is built very differently. It's geared specifically for songwriters, especially songwriters who are like workshopping their things like live. And so I kind of found myself in a very similar boat. And again, my partner and I are kind of like, like, I don't know if we're going to stay here. Like we're definitely here for good for now. Like we bought a house here, but we also want to like be adaptable, like, and maybe like we're looking in other cities and places to live as well. In fact, Texas was a big consideration. Like I love Austin and Dallas for a variety of reasons. So I'm like, I don't know. It's like you never know what you're going to get. But I'm kind of in the same boat in that I'm just building these different things that I hope to kind of run on their own. I'm going to actually stop Music Business Hacks probably after the season, or at least not make it a daily show, because that's not sustainable for me anymore. Yeah, like being a staff of one, like, okay, I'm going to write, record, edit, produce, publish, and market this thing all on my own. And it's like I don't actually do ads or sell space on the show at all. I just do it because I'm like, I just want to like give some people like something cool to listen to. And so it's just like, well, I think I have a few other things I need to be like focusing in on. And so that's why
I hope you keep doing it. I'd encourage you to just make the format more sustainable for yourself and enjoyable. You put out so much great content, and I personally would hate to see it go. So I hope that you'll find a place where it can continue to put out new content in the future.
Thank you. Well, I mean, at the end of season 1 will mark 365 episodes. So there's
amazing.
There's a lot of stuff there. If you want to listen to an episode, like each episode twice, that's already 2 years worth of content every day. So I'm like, well, I'm sure I'll figure out ways to keep it alive still, like maybe moving it from a daily show to like a weekly recap, or as a way to kind of check out trends, and maybe even like check in with folks like in terms of interviews as well from time to time. Like I'm not exactly sure, but I think one of the things that is demonstrated by your career, and I think also with mine, is like you have to be able to adapt to your current needs, to your goals, and to the market itself. And it's like at this point in time, I kind of see that my priorities are going to be focused on these other creative projects, especially like with the musical, because it's extremely demanding. But it's like, it doesn't mean I don't enjoy this. Like maybe I'll do podcasting like on the side just as a hobbyist, but I need to be able to shift where those priorities are, at least for the moment, and then we'll see what happens from there.
Yeah, and sometimes a break is the best thing for figuring all that stuff out. So, and like you said, regardless, there's so much there to listen to in the future that is really great. Guess what, Simon?
What's up?
I am going to be in Nashville in before mid-October, and after we're done here, I'm going to let you know when and where, and I hope that maybe you can come join me and some other former guests of the podcast for a little get-together.
Oh, yeah, that'd be great. I'm actually, hopefully, it depends on the time, because I'm actually on tour from about August 22nd to November 27th or so, but I'll be popping in back and forth for a couple of days. So hopefully it coincides. I would love to do something in person. But if you're going to be in like Fort Worth, I'm going to be there at the end of September, and a couple other spots. So
it's possible. And you know what? Timing's everything. So I'll consider myself lucky if we can work it out soon. But it sounds like you not only living in Nashville. I have a brother that lives there, which is the reason I'm going, and we have friends that are going to meet us in Lexington, Kentucky. And then I have roots in Dallas, Fort Worth, and I love Austin. I have roots there now because of the podcast. So,
do you do a lot of events for the podcast out in Austin?
I don't. I did a small social gathering out there, which is kind of what I want to do in Nashville, which is literally just like I want to see you guys in person, just to hang out a little bit. I want to introduce you to each other and just have an intimate networking thing. I'd like to do it again. Fortunately, I had a dry run or a dress rehearsal for such things in Austin, and hopefully I'll do it again. But I've met so many great people there as well through the podcast, and I imagine that I will do something again at some point.
Well, either way, I'd be more than happy to introduce you to a number of folks who could be great for that kind of conversation and get together. I mean, one of the things we're blessed with here in Nashville is like there's no shortage of industry people, so they're everywhere. In fact, I feel like I know far more industry people here than I do like artists. But it's just one of the nature of these things.
I bet. Yeah, I was going to say, as you were talking about Nashville, and maybe you were trying to say that the music, the business of music there, or the climate of music there wasn't exactly what you expected. But most of the original artists that I've had on the Unstarving Musician don't spend a ton of their time playing in Nashville proper, but they are doing things like some of these, I remember what they're called, but basically where they're showcasing some of their new material and doing it with other original artists, and then they're touring outside those areas. Me, on the other hand, based on my past work that I've done, you'd definitely see me down on Broadway gigging with every band that would have me.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a big difference between just like a gigging musician and someone who's like composing or composing music and hoping that like a big artist is going to take up their song. And so that's what I see a lot of the people here. They're playing in it's like a signature thing here. It's called a Nashville Round, where they'll have like 3 to 5 artists on stage at the same time, and they all like take turns, each one playing one song. They might introduce it really quickly. And then when everybody does one song, it goes around again. So, which is why they call it a round. They'll do that like 3 times, and that's like your show. And then everyone steps down, and another set of like 3 to 5 artists will go up there. And they almost always go up there with like a single acoustic guitar. It's like a really stripped down version of the song, but that's how they kind of test it. And they're also trying to hope that, someone in the audience is like, a producer at Sony Music or something who's going to be like, oh, I want that song.
Right.
But it's like a really weird format. Like it's not like everyone's up there for a 30 to 45 minute set and then like one at a time. It's just like you just get that one song, and then like a few songs later it'll come back to you. So it's I always find it really fascinating, because I'm like, how are these artists trying to distinguish themselves from each other? Like, I've been to maybe half a dozen of these things, and between those have seen maybe 50 to 75 singer-songwriters. Most of them are not memorable to me. Like a lot of the music is very similar, and they don't really do anything other than like, hey, follow me on Instagram. But they don't even say what their Instagram handle is. So it's like, okay, I don't really remember. And by the time I'm trying to like figure it out, someone else is already playing. So it's like, it's also helped me really think like, how can I tighten up things if I were in that setting, and I played maybe 2 rounds myself, like how can I differentiate myself? How can I make sure that 5 minutes at a time, I make sure to grab people's attention in a way that like builds a connection? And I think that's also like helped inform like when I do a traditional show, like at a concert, because like I can't take it for granted that everyone is going to be paying attention to all 60 or 90 minutes of my set. People might be arriving late. People might be meeting friends. So how can we make it, how do we create moments on stage where they actually connect?
Yeah, that is a really great thing to bring up. When I first became enamored with being a musician, I tended to admire these virtuoso types who could just walk up and blow people away with their playing and nothing more. But I think definitely more recently in life, and given the climate that we're in now, it certainly does help to differentiate yourself. And that can be through your music. But certainly your look and the type of music is a big thing. And then what you'd mentioned earlier, the creativity extending into the business part and the community building part today, I would imagine, is huge for those folks, and like you say, for yourself, and even for me.
Have you adopted any particular tactics or things to like stand out, but both in terms of like on stage as well as off, like when you're pitching or booking or things like that?
Well, mine has been basic. I could arguably step it up, but mine has been basic, which is to dress the part, and I don't dress real fancy, but to dress the part, look good, work on my craft of playing, and serve the people that I'm on stage with, and that has worked with me. Obviously, the other big thing, and really the Unstarving Musician's Guide to Getting Paid Gigs, is a book about relationships, because the whole thing about pitching anyone for anything is to try and have some sort of relationship with them. And hopefully one, the harder part to me, and the part that I kind of yearn for, is to keep those relationships going. Like when we're done here today, I know we'll be in touch a bit. But what has happened to me, one thing about the podcast, I go back and look at these people's names, and I'm so excited to go to potentially see some of them in person for the first time, like in Nashville, for instance. And I think about them a lot. I think about all of you quite a bit. And so that's been the challenging part. And I hope I answered the original question.
No, I think it's great. I think that's something that a lot of people fail to realize, that when you're pitching, you're not doing it to, like, the goal of your email when you're booking a show isn't to get a show. Like, not entirely. Your goal is to develop a relationship with the venue who can help support you throughout your career, and you can support their business by selling tickets and drinks. It's like, it's much more than what it seems on the surface level. Like, so when we approach things as if it were going to be a long-term relationship, I think we invest a bit more energy, time, and thoughtfulness into it. Same thing if you're like trying to pitch to get someone to sponsor your music, like a business or a music instrument company or something like that. Like, if you treat it as transactional, people aren't going to care that much. But if you're saying, like, I want to build a relationship, I want to build a partnership with you, all of a sudden those exchanges have a lot more thought. Like, when you start realizing that your EPK, the goal of it isn't to just get a gig, it's to build that relationship. Or the goal of your sponsorship packet is not to get a sponsorship, it's to get a meeting so that you can actually have that exchange. Like, all of a sudden our efforts can be far more effective, and we can start measuring that return on investment a lot more, because it's that we're looking at it from that much bigger picture, and it's certainly much more rewarding. Like, I as you kind of mentioned, like, I've had previous guests of these shows where I've gone to their shows, or we've met up in various cities, and it's awesome. It's like, I love it. I love being able to go to LA or New York or Seattle and seeing, like, people who have been on the show, meeting them for the first time. Maybe I'm going to one of their gigs, or if I'm on tour, they're at mine. But it's so much nicer because we realize we're building a community. It's I don't know, it's just really cool.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing up that whole sponsor thing and how relationships playing into that, because as obvious as it may seem, it would be to me, just based on whatever I may have said here, for people who are listening to me maybe for the first time, I forget when I go from one thing to another. For instance, I've just begun to embark down this crowd support model, tippy-toeing into it, as I call. And just what you said, it's a beautiful example of how I forget. Look, just go back to think about the email that you sent to Simon or whomever, and think about that conversation. You've heard it before, and apply that to this, and it works almost exactly the same and beautifully. One of my other friends actually knew in San Jose, California, and he's been on the podcast. His name is Aki Kumar. He did a return visit recently, and he spoke quite a bit about humility, just based on some questions I'd asked him, and reminding me and listeners that goes a long way in helping us remember these things that you're kind of reminding me of, or that we're talking about, that the relationships, the partnerships, and we're working this thing together, whether you're a venue or a booking person. You're not here to serve me. I'm here to try and help you first, and then hopefully it's a nice partnership.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I hope that our schedules line up so that I could see you here in Nashville. but at the very least, I'll be more than happy to connect you with other folks here who I think would make great guests on your show, or at least great for future conversations for your other endeavors.
Yeah, that is always appreciated for anybody who's thinking about starting a podcast. Oftentimes finding quality guests like Simon Tam is the hardest part. And so I learned that about halfway through the journey so far. Like, I should just ask the people who've been on if they know someone that they think would fit as an amazing, artist like themselves. And yeah, always appreciate it. Hopefully we do get to line up in Nashville. And if not, I will totally understand. And hopefully I'll see some stuff on Instagram or wherever you post those tour happenings. And I have a feeling that we might be able to align in the same physical space at some point in the future.
Well, thank you so much for Bonzo.
Hey, thanks again for listening. If you are loving the podcast, please visit unstarvingmusician.com/crowd sponsor to learn about the various ways that you can offer your support. And again, if you're a listener, I consider you a supporter, especially if you shared it with a friend. Thank you. Have you heard of Bandzoogle? Yep, they're powering websites for musicians all over the world. Their easy system will get you online fast. They have tons of mobile-friendly templates to help you custom design your site and content. It's built for musicians by musicians. They make it easy to sell merch, grow your email list, integrate your socials, and they offer support from a musician-friendly team 7 days a week. Plans are affordable. Go to bandzoogle.com to start a free trial, and be sure to use the promo code Robonzo to get 15% off your first year. That's bandzoogle.com, promo code Robonzo, ROBONZO. Look for show notes and links to most everything mentioned in this episode at unstarvingmusician.com/podcast. Thanks so much for listening. With a whole lot of gratitude, peace, love, and more cowbell.